Emphasis. We're going to be talking today about what is important in your composition. So our composition, again, is all of the things that go into making up our image and where we choose to point the camera or the viewfinder or what we choose to include in our drawing or painting. And we're going to be talking about what is the important thing in that composition. What do we want to get people to notice? What do we want to stand out? What is the focal point? What is the most important thing? And how can we get people to notice what we want them to notice? All right, our first image that we're talking about here is Man Coming Up Subway Stairs, 1952 by DeCaravra. I want you to ask yourself what the first thing you notice when you look at this image is. Okay, that oftentimes is a good indicator as to what our focal point is. And some of you are going to see different things first. Most of you, I think, in this image are going to be seeing either the man's shirt in the center or the window in the top left corner. And a couple of reasons. One, they're the only two white-ish colored, they're the two brightest objects. And also the man in general is right in the center of the composition. Right, so even if we notice the window first, pretty quickly we're going to get kind of bored of that window. There's not a lot of interesting things. There's a little bit of texture we can see, which kind of makes it interesting, but it's just a white square and there's nothing much to look at, right? So we're going to immediately be drawn back to the main focal point, which is this man going up the stairs. And one of the reasons we notice him is because he's right in the center, and that's going to be the first technique that we're talking about here. When you put something in the center, it's going to draw attention, and that's sort of the default way that a lot of people will just even take pictures. You give someone a camera and take a picture, they're going to put something in the middle and push the button, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing to do. This next image is Untitled, 1969 by Uelsmann. He often untitles a lot of his work in an effort to, I think, allow the viewer to make up their own mind about what the image is about and not to impart too much of his own ideas onto the viewer. And those of you who don't know, Jerry Uelsmann does all kinds of photo manipulations like this way before there was such a thing as Photoshop and computers, and he continues to use traditional darkroom techniques to produce images like this. You can check him out. There's lots of information about him if you want to see how he does that kind of stuff. And here again, though, we can see the basic idea is that the main focal point, this floating tree with the roots pulled out of the ground and combined with this little like island and the reflection underneath there, whatever that is, looks like some ice or something. All of that stuff is right in the center of our image. Pretty straightforward. Put something in the center, people will notice it. All right, so I chose to put this image right after because it's also a bit of a photo manipulation of sorts. This is photos taken in London in 1940 by Fred Morley. And 1940, if you're not, maybe you're forgetting your history here, this is obviously during World War II. It was the morning after a bombing raid at night, 32nd night in a row, actually, I think. And so this photographer Fred goes out, and he's trying to find images so that the people can see what's going on, right? And so he finds these firefighters putting out this fire, and he asks his assistant to put on this milkman costume and carrying the milk like the milkman normally would do. But it is a staged image, but at the same time it allowed the photographer to take a picture of all this destruction and have it published, because the government would didn't want people to see how bad things were necessarily, right? So they needed sort of a rationale to why should we show people all this despair, right? And instead of showing the destruction, it's showing people carrying on with their normal business. And as part of this whole, you guys have heard the keep calm, carry on, and all these different plays off of those ideas, and that's where it originated, right? Was during World War II. And that was sort of the motto for the British people. It's sort of the British advertising campaign to keep calm and carry on, and don't let all of this destruction kind of keep you from living your life in some ways. And so this image became really important. Is a pretty famous image. And we see our Milkman right in the center. All right, this is Oliver Biener Group number 4 in 1956 by Roy DeCarava. And I don't know much about this image other than it's a really cool image. And when we look at this, we're going to see our focal points become the silhouette of this band, I think, which is right in the center again of our composition. Also, to help it out a little bit, we've got this cool ceiling, and all of the lines in the ceiling converge in the center as well, which is a different technique we'll talk a little bit about later. You'll notice that we don't always have only one method being used to create a strong focal point in an interesting image. We've got multiple things happening usually. So they're not all like mutually exclusive by any stretch, okay? You're going to use multiple techniques here, but we're just looking at centering here mostly right now. And we're going to also notice probably at some point we got these people having a conversation here in the bottom right, and it's just a really cool image. It's the second Roy DeCaravra image I've used. I'm going to use a few more later on, as I think as far as famous photographers go, I feel like people don't know so much about him, and he's got some really awesome images. Here's another Roy DeCaravra. This is called Lingerie, 1950. We've been talking about centering, but if we look at this image, the center is noticeably absent. Okay, there's not much going on in there. And so what are the focal points, and what is making them focal points? What do you guys think here? I think we notice these boys sitting around in different spots, leaning over the edges and things like that. And I don't know if this shot has been staged or if he just kind of captured these kids like this. But what makes them stand out is the contrast in value, right? We would use the word color if it was a color photo, but it's a black and white image, so we use value. The white shirts on all these kids makes them kind of pop out against this darker background. Also, we've got these really cool lines made out of these stairwells moving in all different directions that are helping to move our eye around the image, and makes it really interesting and dynamic, creating these diagonal lines typically add energy to an image and create movement. Really cool image, and the title is a result of this sign up here in the top right hand corner, if you're wondering why it was titled that. And so we're not using centering anymore. Instead, we are using contrasting value in this case. All right, so this is a portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer in 1907 by Gustav Klipt. And here, again in the center, what's going on here? Not a lot, except some cool patterning. And the main attraction here is up in the top right corner. This is the main focal point, which is her face, of course. And pretty unconventional composition because, again, it's up in the top corner. And the whole rest of the image is mostly all these cool gold patterns and stuff, right? And so what's drawing our eye up here is the fact that her face is the only part, as we can see here in the whole thing, her face is the only part doesn't have all this gold and detailed patterning and everything like that, with the exception of her arms, of course. And maybe in the very bottom left corner, we've got this little bit of green, which is pretty important. If you imagine getting rid of that, the picture seems a little bit too unbalanced, right? We've got the face is too isolated into the corner, too pushed away, and we need something in the opposite bottom left corner to kind of balance that out a bit. And so contrast is what we're talking about here. Also important, I think, in and around her face is her hair with that dark black. It's very graphic, this image, right? The only area where we see that kind of detail, sort of anything that looks even real, is in her face, and the rest of it is just, I mean, what is it even? It's just this, it's like we're in an imaginary world or something, right? And where is she? She's not with anybody. She's not in any kind of real place. She's isolated, and she kind of looks a little bit sad and lonely, I think, too. This image is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz of Georgia O'Keeffe's hand. It's called Hand and Wheel, done in 1933. And when we look at this, we've got two main focal points, really. Her hand, I think, of course, is the main focal point. And then my eye is immediately drawn down to the detail on the center of the wheel, or the V8 symbol. And so we've got contrast going on here, of course, in the values. I would say color. If it was a color photograph, it's a black and white, so we use the word value usually. And of course, her hand is very white against the dark background, which makes it stand out. Same thing with the little logo. It's a little shinier down there. But the other thing that's going on is we've got this contrast of her skin against something human, against this machine and this shiny metallic surface. This image is Karina, Paris, 1959, by Frank Horvat. And when we're looking at any image, really, we're trying to figure out what stands out, what is the focal point, or what are the focal points, and how the image is put together, what makes it work. So I think, I'll say let's give a second here and figure out what you guys think. What do you notice first when you look at this image? Obviously, you're not going to answer, so I'm going to guess that you notice the girl in the center. We talked about centering already, so we're using that technique. Again, none of these techniques are mutually exclusive of one another, and in a good, well-composed image, you're going to see multiple things being used together. So she's right in the center, and she stands out also because her dress is white against this muted grays and dark grays of the background. And the other thing that makes her stand out, a different type of contrast, not just the value. You can have anything that's different is going to stand out, right? So you can have contrasting textures, colors, values, lines, anything that's different. And in this case, I think what makes her stand out is the fact that she's wearing this beautiful dress, and yet people behind her are not. They look like they're out of the market or something, waiting in a line. They're wearing coats. They don't look like they've got a lot of money necessarily, and she looks so out of place wearing a dress when everybody else is wearing jackets. And she looks like she's posing for the image, for the photographer, which she is. Frank Horvat was a fashion photographer, and this is shot specifically for that purpose. And here's another image, also by Frank Horvat, also Karina, and you can see he's using the same composition again. She's right in the center, wearing a white dress, or light colored dress, and the background is all dark and highly composed. These people looking at in different directions and things like that, though I think compared to the first one, looked a little more natural, where the people were wondering, like, who is this and what girl, why is she standing here, right? This is the Monet family in their garden at Argenteuil in 1874. It's a painting by Edward Manet, not to be confused with Monet. The little A there makes them quite different. And we're looking at this image. I think, initially see the woman in the center in the white dress. Again, similar sort of idea from the Horvat photo we just looked at, right? And then we see the little boy next to her, leaning against her with this bright blue, and then drawn back to the man also wearing blue. So we've got this repetition of color that helps move our eye from the blue in the center out to the edges. Sort of like I don't know why. It sort of works like a magnet or something, right? If you're looking at one color and there's something else of the same color, that might be the next place we go. So we're drawn into the center using contrast and the location of being in the center. And then we can see these other little bits of color, and we start looking at those things and coming back to the center all the time. She's definitely the main attraction, let's say. The other thing we notice here maybe is that she is, along with the boy, they kind of function as like a single unit because they're like attached. If we don't think of them as people and just look at the image in terms of colors and shapes and things, they are kind of one thing in the middle and they're isolated. There's space around them, right? And that helps make them stand out. This photo, Woman on Train, 1961 by Roy DeCarava. We're looking at this image, and of course we're going to notice the woman because there's really nothing else there. Everything is kind of this blurry background, and the only other thing we can see is the edge of this train here that she's getting on. She's kind of looking back, looking sideways over her shoulder. She looks a little concerned maybe about her environment, and she stands out because she is isolated by herself. And although we do get the feeling that off camera there's something else going on, right, which is kind of this interesting contrast as well. And in the last image we looked at, the Monet family, the woman was sort of isolated in the center. The guy was there with her, but this is a very different type of isolation where there's literally nothing else to see almost. This is the rehearsal of the ballet on stage circa 1874 by Edgar Degas. When we look at this image, it's all kind of muted tones. They're all kind of similar. So we don't have a strong contrast in values or colors. But yet we notice this young lady here, I think, as the main focal point. And if we don't notice her right away, I think we'll end up coming back to her a number of times as we look at this image. Right, our eye might move up towards the top of the stage there and notice the other girls dancing. There's some windows and the curtains and set directions, set decorations and things like that. Also up there there's a man up there. The only other really the darkest black that we can see, I think, is the man sitting there. He's got a top hat on and almost the same color as the young lady in the foreground's hair, which is a little darker than everybody else's. And we notice her, I think, because she is isolated. We've been talking about isolation. If you've got something all by itself, you are of course going to notice it. And when we look at this image, I think we'll notice that she is definitely all by herself. Even though there's a bunch of other dancers on stage, they are in that three-dimensional space. She's sitting alone, isolated from everybody else, but also even visually on this flat surface, there's almost nothing else touching her really, and she's looking in the opposite direction. She's not talking with anybody, she's not practicing. And we'll notice again the man up there, I think, and our eye kind of flicks back and forth, and we start to get this kind of uneasy feeling that he's kind of looking at her in a funny way maybe, and getting a little bit creeped out maybe by this guy, which would be appropriate because back then the ballet in that time period was used as a place for men to pay for the services of the dancers that they liked, and that's one of the ways the ballet made money. And so this woman here definitely looks isolated, and there's sort of a psychological isolation maybe even that we could say is being used here. So far we've looked at 3 different techniques to create strong focal points. We've looked at centering, we've looked at creating contrast of any sort, color, value, texture, ideas, and we've looked at isolation. So that will be the end of part 1 of this video here. and I will endeavor to make a part 2. We'll talk about a couple other ideas.